Over the past 60 years, there has been a significant shift in how historians perceive President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In a survey conducted in 1962, Eisenhower was ranked 22nd amongst presidents, considered just an average leader, comparable to Chester A. Arthur, and slightly superior to Andrew Johnson. However, by the 1980s, his standing had risen to 11th place, and by 1994, he had climbed to 8th. This position has remained consistent, as evidenced by current polls of presidential historians. Among presidents who served in the last 75 years, he was surpassed in ranking only by Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman. So who was the real Dwight D. Eisenhower? Why has his perception among historians shifted? And what were his accomplishments and failures? Let's find out.
Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History.
Born on October 14, 1890, in Denison, Texas, Dwight David Eisenhower spent his youth in the small farm town of Abilene, Kansas. His father, David, worked as a mechanic in a local creamery. His mother, Ida, a Mennonite, was a religious pacifist who opposed war. Eisenhower did family chores, delighted in hunting and fishing and football, and eagerly read military history. In 1911, he won an appointment to West Point, where he played football until he suffered a serious knee injury. His pranks, fondness of cards and smoking, and average grades earned him little respect from his instructors. They thought he would be a good officer, but not a great one. After graduating in the middle of his class, 61st out of 164, Eisenhower's first stint was as a second lieutenant at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. It was there that he met and married Mamie Dowd. Later, at Camp Meade, Maryland, Eisenhower became friends with George S. Patton. Both Eisenhower and Patton published articles in 1920 advocating that the Army make better use of tanks to prevent a repetition of the static and destructive trench warfare of World War I. But Army authorities considered Eisenhower insubordinate rather than a visionary and threatened him with a court-martial if he again challenged official views on infantry warfare. Eisenhower was shortly transferred to a new assignment in the Panama Canal Zone as the executive officer for General Fox Connor, who appreciated Eisenhower's critical thinking about infantry warfare. Connor arranged for a prize appointment that helped propel Eisenhower's career as a student at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Eisenhower graduated first in his class of 245 officers, and he was quickly given important assignments. He served as an aide first to General John J. Pershing, commander of U.S. forces in World War I, and then to General Douglas MacArthur, the Army's chief of staff. Eisenhower remained with MacArthur for 7 stormy years. The two men were extremely different. They often disagreed, although Eisenhower, as the junior officer, still had to carry out the general's orders. Eisenhower loyally served MacArthur even when it meant dispersing the Bonus Army, a group of unemployed veterans from World War I who protested in Washington, D.C. during the Great Depression. See our video on the Bonus Army for more details. Following the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939, Eisenhower assumed a significant role in coordinating field maneuvers for the Third Army in Louisiana. These large-scale training operations, involving over 400,000 troops, showcased Eisenhower's aptitude for strategic planning and led to his promotion to Brigadier General. Days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Eisenhower went to Washington, D.C. to work on U.S. war plans against the Japanese. Eisenhower impressed the Army Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall, a keen but stern judge of military ability who rarely spoke words of praise. Promotions and critical assignments quickly followed. In November of 1942, Eisenhower commanded Allied troops that invaded North Africa in Operation Torch. The next year, he directed the invasions of Sicily and Italy. In 1944, he was the Supreme Commander in Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe. In only a few years, Eisenhower had risen from an obscure lieutenant colonel to a four-star general in charge of one of the greatest military forces in history. By dealing sympathetically with Allied leaders, Eisenhower achieved the cooperative efforts that enabled him to launch the D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. After Germany's surrender in May of 1945, Eisenhower received a hero's welcome. Yet peace also brought controversy for Eisenhower in his role as commander of U.S. occupied forces in Germany. He endured criticism for allowing the Red Army to liberate Berlin in the final days of fighting. Eisenhower, however, thought he made the right decision, as he adhered to previous agreements about how far the troops should advance and avoided unnecessary casualties to the forces he commanded. Eisenhower had to take an unpopular step when he relieved his old friend George Patton as the military governor of Bavaria because of the general's violation of orders against using former Nazis in government positions. Eisenhower also adhered strictly to a provision of the Yalta Agreement that he returned all Soviet citizens in the U.S. occupation zone, even political dissidents who had no desire to go back. At the end of 1945, Eisenhower returned to Washington, D.C., becoming the Chief of Staff of the Army. He served in that capacity for 2 years and made important decisions to transform the wartime Army into a force prepared for the Cold War. After retiring from the position of Chief of Staff, he wrote a popular memoir of his wartime experiences, Crusades in Europe. He served as the president of Columbia University beginning in 1948, although he returned occasionally to Washington to serve as an informal chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as they discussed how to apportion service roles and missions in the new nuclear age. Soon after war broke out in Korea, Eisenhower returned to uniform as the first Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe. During the Korean War, President Truman became extremely unpopular. Truman's decision to fire Douglas MacArthur as commander of the United Nations forces was an important factor in his public disapproval. So too was the deadlock in fighting in Korea. Republicans expected to win the presidency in 1952 as Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio became the leading candidate for the GOP nomination. But some prominent Republicans considered Taft an isolationist since he had opposed the formation of NATO and talked instead about building up defenses in the Western Hemisphere. They tried to interest Eisenhower in the Republican nomination, confident that his popularity would carry him to victory and certain that his internationalist policies were essential to success in the Cold War. In public, Eisenhower said he had no interest in politics because he had to devote his full attention to his duty as commander of NATO forces in Europe. But in January of 1952, Eisenhower announced that he would be willing to accept the call of the American people to serve as president. In the New Hampshire primary, Eisenhower won a big victory over Taft. At the Republican convention in Chicago, Eisenhower's political managers won a critical battle over the disputed delegates and managed to seat their delegates rather than Taft's in a few key states. As a result, Eisenhower won the nomination. For vice president, Eisenhower chose Senator Richard M. Nixon of California, who had helped his campaign managers secure votes in the dispute over delegates. The Democrats picked Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, a witty politician whose thoughtful speeches appealed to liberals and moderate Democrats. But as a campaigner, he was no match for Eisenhower. Eisenhower inspired confidence with his plain talk, reassuring smiles, and heroic image. He kept a demanding schedule, traveling to 45 states and speaking to large crowds from the caboose of his campaign train. The slogan, "I like Ike," quickly became part of the political language of America. Eisenhower also got his message to the American people through a 30-second television advertisement, the first time TV commercials played a major role in the presidential election. On Election Day, Eisenhower won a big victory with 55% of the popular vote and a landslide in the Electoral College with 442 votes to Stevenson's 89. He even scored well in what had been a Democratic solid South, taking a larger percentage of the popular vote than any previous Republican candidate, capturing Virginia, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas. However, critics in the 1950s would soon scorn Eisenhower as a do-nothing president. Eisenhower's presidency was criticized for his frequent golfing and fishing trips, and wondered whether he was leaving most of the business of government to his White House assistants. They also listened to his meandering, garbled answers to questions at press conferences, and wondered whether he grasped the issues and had clear ideas about how to deal with them. But as time passed, and more records from the Eisenhower administration became available for research, it became clear that Eisenhower was a strong leader who was very much in charge of his own administration. For instance, Eisenhower negotiated an armistice in Korea only 6 months after taking office. For the rest of his presidency, peace prevailed, even at times when Cold War tensions were high. Eisenhower also did not adopt policies that jeopardized strong economic growth during the 1950s, and he made decisions that stimulated the economy, such as supporting the construction of the 41,000-mile-long road system, the Interstate Highway, which is still the single largest public works program in U.S. history. People often remember the Eisenhower years as happy days, a time when Americans didn't have to worry about the depression of war as they had in the 1930s and 40s, or difficult and divisive issues as they did in the 1960s. Instead, Americans spent their time enjoying the benefits of a booming economy. Millions of families got their first television and their second car and enjoyed new pastimes like cocktail parties and barbecues. Eisenhower also thought that the government should provide some additional benefits to American people. He signed legislation that expanded Social Security, increased the minimum wage, and created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He also supported government construction of low-income housing, but favored more limited spending than had Truman. Upon assuming office, Eisenhower confronted two significant civil rights matters. He upheld President Harry Truman's directive to integrate the federal workforce and the armed forces, a process completed within Eisenhower's first year in office. Secondly, and of greater consequence, was a matter pending before the Supreme Court. Upon Eisenhower's inauguration, the Brown v. Board of Education case was already under consideration by the court, eventually emerging as the pivotal civil rights case of the 20th century. Eisenhower would have a major impact on Brown v. Board through his appointments. His choice of Attorney General Herbert Brownell, who was a supporter of civil rights and in his brief argued that any state-mandated inequality that came about from segregated schools was unconstitutional and a violation of the 14th Amendment. In response to the Brown v. Board of Education, the Little Rock School Board in Arkansas had decided on a plan for integration, starting at the high school level and then slowly moving downwards. But when the school year started, a white mob and the National Guard blocked the students from attending. Eisenhower had a meeting with Arkansas's Governor Fabus at the White House, and Eisenhower felt that Fabus would resolve the conflict upon his return to Arkansas. When Fabus continued to deny entry to the students and the Little Rock District Court handed down an injunction against him, Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10730, which sent federal troops from the 101st Airborne Division to stop the injustice that was playing out at Central High in Little Rock. In the matter of national security, spending was high during the Eisenhower years. However, the president did not give in to temptations to spend even more. Even after the Soviets launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, On October 4, 1957, Eisenhower resisted panicked public demands for huge increases in military spending, since he knew that the nation's defenses remained strong. He insisted he would not spend 1 penny less than was necessary to maintain national security, and not 1 penny more. Although he avoided war, Eisenhower did not achieve the peace he desired. He was unable to secure a test ban treaty, which he hoped would be an important part of his legacy. In his farewell address, Eisenhower concentrated not on the threats he had confronted abroad, but on the dangers of the Cold War at home.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
President Dwight Eisenhower tried to pull back the reins on the U.S. military intervention in other countries with his warning about the military-industrial complex. But he did not apply that same restraint to the covert CIA interventions in other countries. 170 covert interventions, to be exact, that he worked very hard to protect and keep secret from Congress and the public. The first country to be tried and condemned under the Eisenhower Doctrine was Iran, a decision whose reverberations are still being felt today, as seen in the current conflict in the Middle East. The problem in Iran was not communism, but neutralism and nationalism. In 1951, Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh was carried into power on a wave of nationalism. He aimed to rescue Iran's oil from Britain so that the people of Iran, not the stockholders of the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, could benefit from its profits. On July 11, 1953, Eisenhower gave presidential approval for Operation Ajax, the very first CIA coup, and Mossadegh was removed from power. That coup would start a historical tidal wave which led to the rise and fall of the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Mossadegh's US-friendly replacement, and would later contribute to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which placed the current regime in power. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who succeeded Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the father of the Iranian Revolution, are the only two men to have held office in Iran since the founding of the Islamic Republic in 1979. Eisenhower would also help deliver the first CIA coups in Latin America, as seen in Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia. The effects of those foreign policy measures are also still being felt today. Eisenhower, in short, achieved both important successes and often turned a blind eye to the CIA's meddling abroad. He left office a popular president, and his stature has grown with the passage of time. President Eisenhower died of heart failure on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. He was buried in his World War II uniform in Abilene, Kansas. Good president, bad president, we let you decide.
Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or show ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.